Tabs open. All right, so usually when it says I'm setting up your meeting for YouTube, that means we're live. So welcome to Dive into World Building. I am just going to stay here on this window long enough to make sure I'm not going to be talking over myself literally. And then we'll get started on our topic for the day. Tabs open. Oh, you see? I have always got to do that. It will bring it up and be like, oh yeah, sure, of course, we're totally doing this. And now then it'll start playing us over us. Anyway, all right, here we go. So today we're talking about real people in strange worlds. And I told my husband that and he looked at me blankly. And I'm like, you know, it's really clear what I mean. But what I mean is, we've talked about the idea of realism in world building before. But I'm not sure that we've talked about sort of realism on the character level as much. And that's one of the critical ingredients, I think, for helping people to stay grounded is to make sure that they have a human character or a character with issues that humans might be able to relate to on some level, to keep them grounded as the environment or the setting goes stranger and stranger, right?
But I think it's a continuum. I'm going to tell a little bit about a book I just finished listening to for a future podcast to illustrate my point. So I've been listening to the book Trickonomics. I don't know if any three of you have read it.
Mm-hmm.
And
I haven't read it, but
so the author basically discusses the economics of the Star Trek universe, and he goes off on this tangent about relatable characters and how he as a person relates to Captain Archer and Captain Kirk much better than Picard and the Enterprise D, as much as he likes that series, because they're on the other side of a technological singularity and they have this post-scarcity society. So he doesn't relate to the characters and their motivations. They don't feel as human to him as Kirk does, because, you know, if you watch the Next Generation, Picard and the rest of the crew are much more placid in a way that this author at least argues is not as relatable. I don't buy this argument, but I found it interesting that he finds the Enterprise D crew much less relatable because of the society they live in is so different than ours that he has troubles connecting them in a way he doesn't have troubles with Picard or Archer or the early movies.
Well, okay. Okay, so relatability is a different kind of question, right? Like what makes somebody relatable? I mean, I suppose we can connect it to this idea of realism / grounding, in as much as it helps if you feel that the issues that the character is dealing with are sort of plausible on a level.
Well, or
that
not real to them, because they don't have to deal with lots of the things that we have to deal with, so they feel less real as a result, because they don't have to. They have limitless resources except for some things like dilithium crystals, so their whole concerns and mindset are just not real to him in a way.
Well, you know, it's funny because one of the things that comes instantly to mind is the idea of learning and plasticity, right? That the more familiar you become with a setting, the more that you internalize aspects of that setting as norms, right? And so the first show that you ever watch in a setting is likely to set your norms. And then if something changes, all of a sudden you have a bunch of expectations that might go against, right? Which I think is a different kind of issue from, well, I just don't find lack of scarcity plausible, because, you know, like,
oh, he finds
setting that aside is actually not that hard.
Yeah, he just finds that the characters that that live in that milieu, not something he can grok properly. which
Yeah, I
find
don't
very
know.
strange.
That's
Well,
interesting.
they're not relatable, right? I mean, that's part of what you run into when you're building characters, particularly when you're working with alien worlds or working with alien characters from different groups, is finding those touchstones, right? Finding those cross connections, and they can be things like, the supermarket's out of beer, and I have to pay my rent this month, and those are all points of commonality that I think later, TGen definitely didn't make. Right. Those were all things that they didn't have to worry about. Their problems were bigger. Their problems were, dealing with scarcity of other people and how to get this group to stop shooting. They were all much higher concept than, Enterprise and Archer would have, which is stuff like, hey, we're going to be floating adrift for a month because we, blew a hole in the warp core and it's going to take time to fix it. Right. Which we've all had. Anybody who drives a car has run into a relatable moment when your hardware fails you. So
I hate it when the warp core blows in my car.
Oh,
It's not
please.
covered under warranty.
Oh, please. I had a hole
It's
in
a-
the radiator, and that was a miserable experience trying to limp back home. That was not great.
And
Yeah.
the thing is, you never trust radiators again after that. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like every time your car makes a squeak, you're like,
Every time I go on a grabber, like, oh God, this is going to be the time again. Please no.
Don't make it happen.
So we can relate to characters with those sorts of problems because we have analogous ones. When characters don't have problems or issues that we can have analogous connections to, it's much harder to relate to their day-to-day concerns as people.
Yeah. Okay. So I think part of an author's job is to set down some grounding for characters, etc. But part of the author's job is also to teach people how to relate to characters who are very different from them, right? So it's this interesting,
Especially
mix.
aliens.
Well, yeah, aliens. But I mean,
God,
I'll
look
also
at
put
Kimberly.
all my Varney are aliens, effectively. I mean, they're all humans, but they're all like grown up in different cultures.
I find that interesting because you say they're aliens, but you also say right in the front of the book they're humans like us. Just living in a different
but
place,
I mean,
so.
they're like humans from a different country who we call aliens all the time.
True.
So
Because,
So I'm going to sort of introduce a concept that to this discussion that I'm sure you're all familiar with, that relatability and fitting into a character, human character in this case, a human character fitting into an alien world are often at cross purposes, right? Juliet alluded to teaching the reader how to relate to a character from an alien world. Another way of going about writing a successful book is to create relatable characters who are relatable because they totally don't fit into the world they're in and never actually arise there. I will give an example. Wizard's First Rule by Terry Goodkind, the late Terry Goodkind. I read it specifically to find out why it was successful because I was curious. And the answers that I figured out were twofold. One, he writes really, really riveting descriptions of walking through the woods. Like, they're brilliant. I could read those for hundreds of pages, which is good because he wrote hundreds of pages of it. But the other reason is that he has a medieval feudal society with magic, and all of his major characters think, act, and talk like 20th century Americans who would never be in that world, but they are very, very relatable to the reader. And so here was a very successful series that basically broke the fundamental rule of world building that we would advocate for on this show, which is fitting the characters to the world in which they are living. So I'm going to point out that relatability and accurate world building are sometimes directly at odds, and that to have a successful work of fiction, you don't always have to actually do it the right way that I think all of us would like you to do it.
Well, it just depends on, I mean, I think it depends a lot on reader expectation, right? I mean, if nobody cares whether people actually seem like they grew up in this world that's being described, then I guess you're fine, right?
And I think that's actually true for a lot of readers, you know, or readers who want a character whose politics match theirs, right? Like Baen Books has made a whole cottage industry of publishing libertarian science fiction so that libertarian readers feel comfortable reading it. And that's, you know, that's a business. That's okay, right? And often they construct social experiments where libertarians take over a planet and somehow, you know, the environmental systems aren't destroyed by completely selfish individuals or whatever, you know, and it works. And so, you know, they have these Gedanken experiments, but the outcome of the experiment is foregone and set by the author to reader expectations, and is commercially viable and is, you know, one way of approaching it. But I as a reader,
so what you're saying is that in that case, it's all about reader expectations and not about whether it seems real.
Well, I'm sure it seems real to the writer too, because the writers for this subgenre generally have the same expectations, right? So
sure, but I mean, so basically what you're saying is, though, that a connection between the person and the world that they live in is not necessary, that they have all been teleported there from 20th century Earth to whatever.
Yes, that is what I am saying. In fact, I would argue that in the original Star Trek series, not the movie so much, but the series, Kirk and his crew were 1960s Americans and Russians and wherever, Japanese, transported into the 23rd
Oh my gosh,
century.
have you ever read Little Fuzzy?
Which one?
H.B.
Have any of
Piper.
you read Little Fuzzy?
I have not.
H.B. Piper, the whole series. Oh my goodness. Okay, so every character, every human character in these books was airlifted directly out of the 1960s. And they all drink highballs and they smoke tobacco. And you're like, where did you get this? You know, like,
yeah, well, so much science fiction is like that, right? 1950s.
You've got a great, somehow, you know, cross-stellar universes spanning gin industry. Like, it's just, you know, I mean, okay, I guess there was a time for that. But that's not what the show is for.
No.
Right?
But I guess I don't want the show to be about that either. I just wanted to sort of, as a footnote, say that when you are world building, you should be aware that resonance with the reader, emotional resonance with the reader, which is what Kimberly was talking about, is not always in harmony with proper world building, and is also not always going to lead to a commercially more viable outcome than you know, doing proper world building. But that said,
so
you know, I would move on and
a lot. The field has grown up a lot.
It has.
And
it has.
And
mostly
the field has grown up a lot because the majority of the field is now grown up a lot. And I'm not here to talk about how to satisfy libertarian readers or you know super socialist readers. Honestly, part of what science fiction does is it takes you out of your comfort zone. That's part of the point. And so,
for most readers, yes.
So what I'm saying is, I'm not arguing about this anymore. And what we're going to do here is we're going to talk about what are the elements that allow a person to find something to stand on or cling to while everything else changes, right? So,
Can you be a little more specific, please? What are you talking about? The character finding things to stand on, or the reader? Has anyone else lost Juliet?
Yeah,
Talking
Juliet
about-
Juliet
I
is
think
frozen.
you've been teched. Oh, there we go. You're back.
Up, you're back.
You vanished,
Okay.
Juliet. So whatever you just said, lost to eternity.
Oh no.
Oh.
So
Speaking of
touchstones.
Fuzzy,
This is my dog. Today he is making friends with our new kitten.
nice.
And so I'm holding him so he can have a break, but he's still watching her. Anyway, yeah, distractions.
So you whatever you were just saying vanished. But
Right.
I was
Well,
unclear whether you meant
let's
characters
talk
or
about-
readers.
Let's talk about grounding for a minute.
Okay.
What's grounding? Paul.
Grounding from a reader point of view is giving elements that they can relate to, be it a character, a setting, a world that the reader can immediately relate to, so that they can be drawn further into the story in the more
Sure, or some kind of basic orientation that allows people to set up some basic expectations that they can then sort of judge on the basis of, right?
Yeah.
So like if you're going to, so this is actually one of the things that I've talked about this with regards to the start of novels also, where, people talk about starting with action or starting with this, that, and the other. But if people don't understand the action that's happening because they have no context for it, then
it may be
right?
exciting, but what's the point? And
If
like,
you're
what
not
is going on now?
on the boat, you can't go on the journey, right? So it's the let's board the boat portion of the story, right? And in fact, with Varn books, it's actually quite long. Setting up the let's board the boat section takes a while. So you don't have to have certain kinds of changes that propel the story. But I can't get really, really culturally relativistic and do all those things that I like to do until I've got people knowing what normal is, right?
Right. You can't show change until you show the baseline. So
one of the things that I rely on is human psychology, right? So bye, Kimberly. Good luck with your car driving. So human psychology is something that a lot of people have inside of them because we're humans.
We are not robots.
And so often people will have met someone who has, particular types of issues or that kind of thing. And I find that to be a really great way of allowing people to relate to characters and allowing people to feel more grounded in a world that's unfamiliar.
Yeah, like we're like, I know we shouldn't be talking so much about your books. We're going to talk about this, like the brother relationship in Mazes of Power. I mean, lots of people have siblings, so they can relate to how Nicanor gets along with his brother and vice versa.
Your brother who drives you up the wall all the time.
I can
right?
really relate to that. Yes. So that's a touchstone. That's something people can hook on to. That yes, this is a strange alien human world, but yes, these brothers are still a pain in the butt, just in very different ways.
Yeah,
I don't have my brother trying to become heir instead of me.
I hate my brother. He's a pain in the butt. This is actually not true of my brother. My brother is awesome. we drove each other a little nuts, but like not not that kind of nuts.
So
Anyway, I think it's better not to make assumptions about what kinds of things are required for relatability, because likability is definitely not required. I know people found Nicantor's narration really, some people find it really frustrating to read about the repetitive themes that he finds important.
But as I think I pointed out in my book review, that made me understand him. I don't like him, but it made me understand him.
Right, but the goal is understanding.
Right.
Yeah, I think all of my stories, I say that now wondering if I'm wrong, because there may be exceptions, but I think a great many of my stories aim to teach a reader, or teach a reader sounds really pedantic. Provide new contexts for familiar concepts or familiar character types, right?
New worlds, new settings, new milieus, new situations for character types that you already
Right.
know in the real world.
Same old people.
People are the same all over, to quote the Twilight Zone episode.
So
Yeah,
this
and I
is a
think,
good time. Okay.
So funny.
Esther, I need you to be quiet. Okay.
Okay.
This is a good time to bring up something Octavia Butler taught when she was my Clarion instructor. She had a very, very serious attitude toward writing science fiction, and she was more focused on science fiction than fantasy by a long shot. By a lot. So she said that it's okay to have a fantastic character in a mundane setting, or a mundane character in a fantastic setting. She personally didn't like having a fantastic character in a fantastic setting, because she felt that that left the reader ungrounded by too much fantastic, you know. I don't always agree with her on that, but I think for the most part she's dead on, you know. And so, like, your World of Varin is mundane characters in a fantastic setting, and a lot of Twilight Zone episodes were fantastic characters in a mundane setting. Yes, I have a giggly kid here.
So I'm not sure that I would characterize my Varin characters as mundane characters in a fantastic setting, because they're human characters, but they're very formed by their fantastic setting. So I'm not sure.
Well, yeah, but they don't have superpowers or telepathy or, you know, whatever.
Well, that's because this is science fiction, not fantasy.
She had telepathy in science fiction, but that's, you know.
Yeah, you know,
blame John W. Campbell
another time, because
So funny.
I was just talking with my husband like 2 days ago about why does everybody think telepathy is science fiction?
John W. Campbell. Psych.
Yeah, but like, dude, sit that guy down and go, dude. Basically because a very small group of dudes set up what their expectations were right at the start, and then that became somehow a foundation for things that were supposed to.
Yep.
Right.
Yep. Yes, that's exactly. Yes.
And they were like, telepathy totally counts because I don't know, I like it.
Because Campbell, that's
Because,
that's exactly correct, Juliet. What you just
and trying to break those expectations has been a project of science fiction for a long time.
Yeah.
I think we have, but it took a long time. It's a human expectations that he set up there. But
STL travel also, you know, falls into that.
Sure.
so anyway, so going back to the whole idea, like mundane characters in a fantastic setting, the world of the Varn is fantastic. It's not our world. I mean, our world doesn't have people living underground in cities with with the ground above a dangerous place with things that if you shoot can go boom, and paper is a finite, very finite resource. And so, I mean, the caste system is not so much fantastic as I keep thinking of is as an evolution of some societies in our own world, except taken to levels I haven't seen outside of Jack Vance. But it is a fantastic world. I mean, you have underground waterfalls all over the city that Della and Tagart have arrived. I'm enchanted, by the way. But it's like, you don't find that in the real world. That's fantastic. And I love it. But
I love it.
But the characters are very human because you made them human. Yes, they have very strange concerns about caste and their needs and wants, but in the end, they're all relatable. I understand them. They're not an alien. They're not a really alien species, like say, I don't know, CJ Cherry's Meat Point Station aliens, for example.
Yeah.
We have one human and then everybody else is an alien, and we have one touchstone, and we have to figure out how everything works from there.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right,
Yeah,
but
because,
you ground. I mean, it's all underground, but you ground the book with very relatable characters, and I mean, people that you could say, the reader would say, well, if I were in this particular situation, in this kind of bizarre underground environment, I might act similarly, or it would be reasonable for me to act that way.
It's a more of a sort of set of principles underlying, like principles of psychology and principles of human relationships, right?
Right.
And a lot of it is sociological study of our world, right?
Right. I mean, because that's the whole idea of science fiction talking about our own world. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, also science fiction being a realm of Gedanken experiments in different societies, right? Well, like, what if we tried this thing? What if we built Plato's Republic? What if we did an entire underground civilization? What if, we took a caste system to extremes? What if we took democracy to extremes? And you get like this demarchy concept that was popular with Werner Vinge and also with Joan Vinge in one work that they started off writing together. And it was not necessarily a good thing. It was just a social experiment and like how it would go south. Because and then the beauty of fiction is you take this experiment and you go and you think, well, what would go wrong? Because that's where I can have a book, right? If everything's going swimmingly, it's not a book. Or it might be a philosophy book like Plato's Republic, but it won't be a novel, right? Yeah.
I'm gonna argue to some extent that one of the things that grounds readers in the Varn stories is that the what of the story is relatively familiar, right? You've got a bad guy, he's trying to do a thing, you've got a good guy, he's trying to do this other thing, right? Like, one of the things that I had trouble with Mazes of Power was when I tried to describe what happened in the book, it sounded really boring. Because the reason that the book works the way it does is not what's happening, it's how it's happening.
Sure. And,
it's more like this story kernel is one that people are familiar with. Well, we've got this aristocracy, and then there's this concern with rulers and successions, and people are going to argue about who gets to be the next person with power. Yeah, okay.
and the two main characters are brothers. Dun dun dun.
Dun dun dun. Right.
Yeah. Well, Honor Harrington books are, Horatio Hornblower in Space, or Song of Ice and Fire is The War of the Roses with dragons, and the others
with power and with family and with these lists of things So it's not as though the core story is not interesting, right? It's just it doesn't really capture what's being done with it.
Well, yeah, and I think we should mention, and I touched on this, but don't want to touch specifically on what I touched on earlier. Different readers read for different things. Some people read to have their minds expanded. Some people read to have their to have their ideas challenged. Some people read to have their ideas confirmed. But a lot of people read for characters. Not everyone. But a lot of people read because they're interested in characters and they want to see well-drawn characters who are multidimensional and believable, put through their paces, as it were, by various plot elements. So, and then I think a lot of writers write because they fall in love with their characters and they want to explore them in extremis,
Sure.
and see how they tick. By stressing them.
So, by comparison, consider, for example, the everyman character. Somebody like, I don't know, Candide is a weird example, but like,
how about Arthur Dent?
I love Candide.
Yeah, but like, so sometimes you've got these characters who are very, detailed and specific, and they have their own issues and dot de dot de dot de dot. And then you have these sort of different kinds of books that sort of gesture at a character, but let the reader sort of reflect a lot of their own characteristics onto that character.
Inhabit the character in some ways, like.
But yeah, or adopt them as themselves. But yeah,
character avatars as.
I think in a way that a protagonist is always an avatar for ourselves, or at least potentially can be an avatar for ourselves.
Right, especially if you have a
work. How hard do we have to work?
Right. It also depends on how many characters you have in the book, what kind of point of view you have, but you can have a character more defined and delineated or less delineated, allowing, as you say, for the reader to project themselves into that character.
That was the word I was looking for. Thank you, Paul. Project.
There.
I was like, reflect. No, that's not it. Yeah.
Sure. And if you have multiple point of view book, then there's a chance that any reader will connect with one or more or zero of the characters, but the characters might vary. Like, I remember distinctly loving Neuromancer, which was all from basically Case's point of view. And then I read Count Zero, and it was from 3 points of view. And I really liked 2 of them, and one of them bored me to tears. I just hated the character. He was boring to me. And so I was just like, oh, another chapter from his point of view.
I hate it. Yes. But yeah, it's like, okay, I have to do work now by standing with cat. Or like Kate Elliott's Unconquerable Sun, which has the title character for most of the book, but then you have chapters from the wily Persephone, and I was charmed by the wily Persephone and her story.
And that was Alexander the Great in space.
Yes, exactly. So that goes back to it's familiar.
That one had a lot of details of history, which I think is another place where you can find characters that people will recognize. And also, of course, sequences of events that people will have heard of before. And so you have these opportunities for familiarity that will get you your author points that you can then spend elsewhere.
Exactly.
Well, that's why Cecilia Holland's historical fictions resonate with a lot of science fiction and fantasy readers, right? Because the past and the future are very similarly distant from the present. Joan Vinci likes to say, because she has a anthropology background, she likes to say archaeology is the anthropology of the past and science fiction is the anthropology of the future.
That's cool.
Yep, she's got a point.
What are you doing?
The past is a different country, as they say.
Oh yeah, it is a very different country. We yes.
And the farther back you go, the more speculative you get, and the more you have to make up to get a narrative. Even if you're writing a paper for peer review.
Whole other can of worms.
We do that in the show. We open so many
You know,
cans or snake cans at the audience. Like,
Here, another can. Oh, we should talk about that next week.
those 15 things, that we just mentioned in the last 10 seconds. Probably should have 15 shows.
Well, I'm planning to continue doing this for a while, so
good.
No shortage of material.
yeah. Well, so I think it would be remiss not to remark on diversity questions, and specifically on how diversity affects our expectations about what relatability means.
There's some really great authors doing diversity lately. One of them just became a SIFWA Grandmaster today.
Nayla Hopkinson.
So cool.
Yes.
So cool.
That is very cool.
But it's funny that you say doing diversity.
It takes conscious thought a lot of the time.
Well, it takes conscious thought to depart from default depiction, right? But
by which you mean the
depiction,
unmarked category of everything.
Well, and it's interesting because it just depends on what you call diversity, right? I just one of the things that I think is really interesting in this regard is that this is, as far as I can tell, a form of realism, right? And a good way to ground people is to have lots of different types of people, because if you look around you, there are a lot of different types of people, right? And not just, because
stories of whole spaceships of white men were never realistic, or
right. That was not ever realism, and so so I try to find as many different types of people as possible in my farm world. But and then I have to reinvent the wheel 10,000 times. But hey, it's fun. I like reinventing things. I like saying, okay, I have to have this same issue that we had, except that it can't work the same way or appear in the same places because I gotta write a whole book now.
Oops.
Right? Anyway, well, this discussion has gotten a little off the rails, but hey, it's been interesting.
Please bring it back.
I think I was trying to talk about character, and then we got into relatability. I don't know. I feel like we talked about some useful things.
Relatability is key to character. If you can't relate,
relatability is culturally grounded, and that has to do with audience, and that has to do with the size of the world and who is in it, and whether you want. I personally want to have my stuff be readable by as many different people as possible, while I go out and try to read from as many different people as possible about as many different ideas as possible. Right. So I think, to me, science fiction is about expanding one's horizons, and there are a lot of horizons out there. But I think that expanding our horizons in terms of just being able to understand different kinds of people and be able to find relatability, to learn relatability, rather than just assume that it's a fixed thing, is an interesting question, right?
Yeah, and the interesting thing about different kinds of people. We're talking about diversity in science fiction, and one of the good things about diverse science fiction in the general sense is it's hopefully forcing people to realize that the world around them is more diverse than they want, and that they realize they have a wrong mental map that their own world is a default, which is not true if you just look slightly, look past one's own blinders to see that it's not that sameness that you think it is, and that way you that you're expecting in a fiction. The world's a lot more complicated and diverse than
It certainly is.
than
Well,
there's-
I think one of the things that's useful to remark is that our sense of our reality is mediated by storytelling. We get told stories by other people about what happens when we read the news. We get told stories by other people about what happened and what was important and what was worth noticing by family members when they come home from work or from school. Like our understanding of reality is mediated by storytelling. And so this is one of the reasons why I think that it's really important for us as storytellers to be aware of the role that we play in helping people to understand their reality and question.
and those stories are potent, and trying to resist the more blinkered ones is difficult. So I'll tell you a story from high school. So I'm going back 30 some odd years. So I had an Indian friend named Gajendra, and I visited his house. We studied together. We were good friends. And I overheard my family talking about Indians in a very unpleasant way. And when I brought this up, they said, "Oh, not your friend. No, they have a nice house." And it's like angered me. It's like, how can you can't carve out the exception that like he's the good one and all the others are bad. It really, really annoyed me. I mean, it was my first real face-to-face with some of the ugliness that underlies a lot of the hometown I grew up in and a lot of the people there and their prejudices. And I was just thinking about this recently because Staten Island, which is where I'm from, plays a major role in N.K. Jemisin's The City We Became, because Staten Island is very different than the rest of the 5 boroughs culturally and sociologically, and not in good ways. And that's the environment I came out of and have been trying to work against in my own thinking ever since.
Yeah, it's interesting. That whole thing about, considering certain people exceptions just because you've met them is another form of storytelling that protects
the overall narrative. Yes.
So there was a Simpsons episode many years ago where John Waters showed up as a character. And I think we lost Juliet again.
Yeah, Juliet seems frozen. So
anyway,
the stream's still going.
Yeah. Anyway, so John Waters is a character, and in the course of whatever ridiculous plot, he winds up saving Homer Simpson's life. And Homer Simpson says, and I think beautifully sums this attitude. He says something like, "Oh, if only every single gay man could save my life, then I would, accept all gay men." And he means it as a compliment, right?
Yeah. Well,
but that is that
somebody
attitude.
wrote that on purpose.
that is that attitude. Well, of course, it was satirizing that attitude, right? The attitude of like, "Oh, you're a good one," know. And the only way for everyone to be good one is for every individual in that entire group to be a good one in the eyes of the prejudiced person. So,
yeah.
But I mean, one of the beauties of science fiction, of course, is that we can show that kind of prejudice without triggering the reader's prejudices, right? By using funhouse mirrors. I mentioned the other week about that famous Star Trek episode with the half white, half black striped people, right? Where they could allow them in 1967 or whenever that episode was to talk about race in a way that didn't involve race. Right?
Yeah, and I think, well, I mean, there are a lot of issues. It would take another whole hour to talk about the degrees of protection that we're affording to members of privileged groups, right? And how far do you have to take it afield from this particular thing before someone is willing to relate to it? And I have issues with that particular Star Trek episode issues, but No, it's good. We're not talking about that right now. But like, yeah, I mean, it's fascinating, but it's a continuing. This is why the field, one of the reasons why I think the field continues to develop and change is because our needs develop and change, and people become more or less able to articulate with certain kinds of issues. And um, yeah, it's pretty fascinating. Pretty fascinating. It's a field I'm happy to be in. Let me say, very happy to be in. So
Yeah, I mean, I'm certainly increasingly pleased with the field as time goes on. Right, I do feel it's maturing on the whole, and obviously, any large group of people are not going to agree on anything, and even what like we said, what readers want isn't always going to agree with what other readers want in the same field. But it does, you know, having different points of view characters allows the opportunity for different readers to relate to a character, to see themselves enough to really resonate with a character.
Multiple points to connect a reader to characters
Yeah.
into the world.
I mean, we're all
Multiple chances.
but also, multiple dimensions. Like, like the Ms. Marvel, right? The young Muslim girl.
Kamala Khan, yeah.
Yes, right. That obviously gave young Muslim girl readers and Muslim boys and Muslim whatever, and other religious minorities that aren't Muslim a chance to connect in a way, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we are all trained to empathize with 20 and 30 something able-bodied cis white het Christian men, right? And anyone who is one of those can just automatically relate. But if you're not all of that, you're trained to relate to it as if you are. And so that's something that, when you start doing what the anthropologists call marked categories, any deviation from the default, then you have to either you have to make a decision about the readers you want to keep and the readers you're willing to let bounce off the work, right? Kat talks about this a lot, about like deciding which readers you are writing to, right? Are you writing to people who need to be like, say you're a Jewish writer and you're describing a Jewish holiday in your text. The question is, how much do you explain to the reader? How much do you assume, well, they can Google it if they want? How much Yiddish do you throw into the narrative without explaining it, if you're going to throw Yiddish into the narrative, right? The same is true for anything. I just read a Caitlin or Kiernan a Tor.com novella, Black Helicopters. And there's a chapter where the whole dialogue for the chapter is in French. And then there's an epilogue to the book, which is Anglais Remix, which is the same chapter where the dialogue is in English.
Interesting.
Which you can now read, knowing more about, because it skips around in time and space, knowing more about the situation that far future set chapter was talking about. But but in the middle, when you encounter it the first time, it's in French and you sink or swim, and the reader can either read French, or the reader can skim it and get an idea, or the reader can copy and paste it into a translation website, or whatever. You're on your own.
Or they can go into the back of the book.
Yeah. But if you know in advance that the last chapter is the same chapter in English, sure, you can go in the back of the book and read it in English right then. But there's no author's note at the beginning saying that that's the case. You are left to sink or swim. And that was a clear authorial decision. In the acknowledgments, Kiernan thanked the professor friend who had translated that chapter into French, all the dialogue. or at least gone over the translation. I think they translated it actually. So this was a design feature. Whether you like the feature or not depends on the reader, but I thought it was great. I was
Well,
fine with
sure.
it.
And I think it's important to acknowledge that even though there are readers who are going to come in and be very disapproving of particular types of story decisions, they're still your story decisions as the author, and you don't have to write for those people. Right?
Right. You just choose, right?
I mean, there's an enormous, just as we're talking about diversity, there's an enormous diversity of audiences. And so, you know, that's worth considering as well.
I mean, you could try to write for as many people as possible, but there are limits. Some people are going to bounce off your work just because of style or prejudices or
sure.
What have you. I mean,
or you know, linguistic background or whatever.
Yeah.
Or something very specific, like the protagonist reminds them of somebody that bullied them in grade school.
Right, for example, right.
And then you're stuck. Or has the same name as somebody they didn't like growing up. You know, they didn't like Fred. Fred was a terrible person, so your character is Fred and they're not going to read it. Yeah, you can't control that.
Right. Well, all right. So this has
I
been
never
very
met Fred I
interesting.
didn't like.
Thank you for being here for me. We are back on our track. I'm gonna try to get myself back on track in terms of like inviting some authors on for this month. But we'll see, because it's December.
It is December.
So in the meantime, I will stop the stream and we will resume next week.